The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Peter's Square as Vatican staff prepared for one of the most significant diplomatic visits of the year. King Charles III of the United Kingdom would soon arrive for a private audience with Pope Francis, marking another chapter in the complex relationship between the British monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti adjusted his red zacchetto as he walked through the apostolic palace corridors, his mind focused on the intricate details of royal protocol. As the Vatican's chief of protocol, he had orchestrated hundreds of papal audiences, but few carried the historical weight of today's meeting. The relationship between British royalty and the papacy had evolved dramatically over the centuries, from Henry VIII's dramatic break with Rome to the gradual warming of relations in modern times. The cardinal paused before a magnificent Renaissance fresco depicting the conversion of Constantine, remembering how religious and political power had intertwined throughout history. Today's meeting represented something different. Not a struggle for dominance, but a collaboration between two institutions seeking common ground in an increasingly secular world. Meanwhile, in his private study overlooking the Vatican Gardens, Pope Francis reviewed briefing documents prepared by the Secretary of State. The 86-year-old pontiff, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, had always been fascinated by the British monarchy's unique position as both a constitutional institution and the supreme governor of the Church of England. Despite theological differences, he recognized in King Charles a kindred spirit committed to environmental stewardship and social justice. Francis closed the folder and walked to his window, watching gardeners tend to the carefully maintained landscapes below. The Vatican Gardens had been a source of contemplation for popes for over 7 centuries, and today they would witness conversations that could shape interfaith relations for years to come. Across the city, King Charles sat in his hotel suite at the Hotel de Russie, reviewing his own preparation materials. The 74-year-old monarch had waited decades to assume the throne, and his reign had already been marked by a commitment to modernizing the monarchy while respecting its ancient traditions. His visit to the Vatican represented more than diplomatic courtesy. It was an opportunity to bridge divides that had persisted for nearly 5 centuries. Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, knocked gently on the door before entering. "Your Majesty, the motorcade will be ready in 30 minutes. The Vatican has confirmed all security arrangements, and Cardinal Torretti will personally escort you through the papal apartments." Charles nodded, his thoughts turning to the gifts he would exchange with the Pope. Royal gift-giving carried deep symbolic meaning, each item carefully chosen to convey respect, shared values, or historical significance. The palace had spent weeks selecting appropriate presents, consulting historians, theologians, and cultural experts to ensure every detail honored both traditions. The king's motorcade departed the hotel precisely on schedule, winding through Rome's ancient streets past the Tiber River toward Vatican City. Tourist groups gathered along the route, smartphones capturing glimpses of the royal standard flying from the lead vehicle. Many had no idea they were witnessing a historic moment in British Vatican relations. As the convoy approached St. Anne's Gate, Swiss guards in their distinctive blue, red, and yellow uniforms snapped to attention. The Vatican's security apparatus, a blend of ancient tradition and modern technology, had been monitoring every aspect of the visit. Metal detectors, background checks, and coordination with Italian authorities ensured the Pope's safety while maintaining the dignified atmosphere befitting such an occasion. Cardinal Torretti stood waiting in the San Damaso courtyard, flanked by other Vatican officials in their formal black cassocks with red trim. The courtyard, designed by Donato Bramante in the early 16th century, had welcomed countless dignitaries over the centuries, but today's visitor represented a particularly significant milestone. King Charles emerged from his vehicle, surveying the Renaissance architecture surrounding him. The Vatican's artistic treasures always impressed visitors, but Charles brought a particular appreciation for classical design and religious art. His long-standing interest in architecture and urban planning gave him a unique perspective on the Vatican's role as both a spiritual center and a repository of human cultural achievement. The formal introductions proceeded according to centuries-old protocol. Cardinal Toretti bowed slightly as he welcomed the king, speaking in careful English accented with his native Italian. "Your Majesty, it is my honor to welcome you to the Apostolic Palace." His Holiness eagerly awaits this opportunity for dialogue and fellowship. Charles replied with characteristic warmth, "Your Eminence, I am deeply grateful for this invitation. The opportunity to meet with His Holiness represents not only personal privilege, but also the continuing evolution of our shared commitment to serving humanity." The procession moved through the Vatican's labyrinthine corridors, passing frescoes by Raphael, Pinturicchio, and other Renaissance masters. Vatican staff lined the hallways, their presence both ceremonial and practical. Each had been briefed on proper protocol, when the presence of both papal and royal authority, a delicate balance requiring respect for two distinct but equally ancient traditions. In the Sala del Trinetto, a small throne room adjacent to the Pope's private apartments, final preparations were underway. Vatican florists had arranged white roses and olive branches, symbols of peace and reconciliation. The room's Baroque decorations provided an elegant backdrop for what promised to be an extraordinary conversation. Pope Francis reviewed his schedule one final time with Monsignor Fabrizio Soccorsi, his personal secretary. The audience was allocated 45 minutes, though both men knew that meaningful dialogue might extend beyond formal time constraints. Francis had a reputation for allowing conversations to develop naturally, preferring authentic exchange over rigid adherence to protocol. "Monsignor," the Pope said quietly, "ensure that our gifts are properly prepared. The symbolism must be clear, but not overwhelming. We seek to honor our guest while acknowledging our theological differences with charity and respect." The gifts themselves represented weeks of careful consideration. Vatican artisans had created a specially commissioned mosaic depicting St. Francis of Assisi feeding birds, acknowledging both the Pope's papal name and Charles's well-known commitment to environmental conservation. Accompanying texts, bound in Vatican library calligraphy, included excerpts from Laudato Si', Francis's landmark encyclical on environmental stewardship. King Charles's gifts were equally thoughtful. A first-edition copy of John Henry Newman's Apologia pro Vita Sua acknowledged Newman's canonization by Francis in 2019 and represented Anglican Catholic dialogue. A specially commissioned silver chalice, crafted by British silversmiths using techniques dating to the medieval period, honored the Vatican's liturgical traditions while showcasing British craftsmanship. As the final moments before the audience ticked away, both leaders reflected on the historical significance of their meeting. Henry VIII's break with Rome in 1534 had created centuries of tension, suspicion, and occasional hostility between British monarchs and popes. While formal diplomatic relations had been restored in 1982, today's exchange would mark a new level of personal engagement between the two institutions. Cardinal Toretti appeared at the Pope's study door, his expression calm but alert. "Holy Father, His Majesty King Charles III has arrived and is prepared for the audience." Francis rose from his desk, straightening his white cassock and adjusting his pectoral cross. At 86, he moved with the careful deliberation of age, but retained the alert eyes and warm smile that had characterized his papacy from its beginning. Today would test his skills as both a spiritual leader and a diplomat, requiring him to navigate complex theological and political terrain while maintaining the pastoral warmth that defined his approach to leadership. The two men walked toward the throne room, their footsteps echoing softly on marble floors polished by centuries of use. Behind them, the Vatican's ancient walls held the memories of countless such encounters, moments when religious and secular power met, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in cooperation, always with consequences that rippled through history. King Charles waited in the antechamber, his thoughts turning to his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had met with 5 different popes during her remarkable reign. Each audience had reflected the gradual warming of Anglican-Catholic relations, And today's meeting would continue that evolution while adding Charles's own perspective as both a monarch and a deeply spiritual individual committed to interfaith dialogue. The great doors opened, and history prepared to unfold once again in the heart of Christianity's most ancient center of power. The massive doors of the Sala del Trinetto swung open with ceremonial precision, and King Charles III stepped into the presence of Pope Francis for the first time. The room fell silent except for the soft whisper of silk cassocks and the distant sound of fountains in the Vatican gardens. Two figures representing nearly 2 millennia of Christian tradition stood face to face, their meeting bridging centuries of complex history. Pope Francis rose from his chair, his weathered face breaking into the genuine smile that had become his trademark. Despite protocol suggestions that he remain seated to receive royal guests, the Argentine Pope preferred to greet visitors on equal footing, literally and figuratively. His approach to papal dignity emphasized accessibility over hierarchical distance. "Your Majesty," Francis said in accented but clear English, extending both hands in greeting, "welcome to our home. It brings me great joy to finally meet the King who has spoken so eloquently about caring for our common home, this beautiful earth that God has entrusted to us all." Charles stepped forward, genuinely moved by the Pope's warmth. Royal protocol had prepared him for formal papal audiences, but Francis's immediate humanity transcended ceremonial barriers. "Your Holiness, the privilege is entirely mine. Your leadership on environmental stewardship and social justice has inspired millions, including myself. I come not just as a monarch, but as a fellow servant of those ideals." Cardinal Toretti discreetly signaled to Vatican photographers positioned in the room's corners. These images would document a historic moment, but more importantly, they would capture the authentic human connection developing between two elderly leaders who had devoted their lives to service. The formal greeting concluded. Both men took their designated seats. Francis chose a simple wooden chair rather than the ornate papal throne, another gesture emphasizing dialogue over hierarchy. Charles sat across from him in an equally modest chair, the arrangement suggesting conversation between equals rather than an audience between superior and subordinate. "I must tell you," Francis began, his eyes twinkling with humor, "when I heard about your lifelong commitment to organic farming and environmental protection, I thought, here is a man who truly understands what St. Francis meant when he called the earth our sister. Your Majesty has been preaching creation care long before it became fashionable." Charles laughed, appreciating both the compliment and the Pope's reference to his papal namesake. "Your Holiness, I've often felt like a voice crying in the wilderness on these issues. To receive validation from the successor of St. Peter himself is both humbling and encouraging. Perhaps together, our voices can reach hearts that individual efforts might not touch." The conversation began to flow naturally, moving beyond diplomatic pleasantries into substantive discussion. Francis leaned forward, his pastoral instincts engaging. "Tell me, Your Majesty, what first awakened your passion for environmental stewardship? Was it a particular moment, or did this understanding develop gradually?" Charles considered the question carefully. "I think it began in my youth, walking through the Scottish Highlands with my grandmother. She taught me to see the land not as something to be conquered or exploited, but as something to be protected and passed on to future generations. Later, studying architecture and urban planning, I began to understand how human activity could either honor or desecrate the natural world." Francis nodded knowingly. Yes. For me, it was growing up in Buenos Aires, seeing how poverty and environmental degradation affected the same communities. The poor always suffer most when we fail to care for creation. This is why I wrote in Laudato Si that care for the environment and care for the vulnerable are inseparable. The Pope's reference to his environmental encyclical opened new avenues for discussion. Charles had studied Laudato Si extensively, finding in its pages a theological framework that complemented his own environmental philosophy. "Your Holiness, that encyclical spoke to me profoundly. The integration of environmental science with spiritual wisdom offers hope that transcends political and religious divisions. I am pleased you found value in those reflections, Francis replied. But tell me, as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, how do you see Anglican and Catholic churches working together on these critical issues? Surely our theological differences need not prevent practical cooperation in caring for God's creation. This question touched the heart of why today's meeting mattered beyond diplomatic courtesy. Both leaders understood that environmental challenges required unprecedented cooperation across traditional boundaries. Charles leaned back slightly, choosing his words with the care of someone who had spent decades navigating religious sensitivities. Your Holiness, I believe our common baptism calls us to common purpose on issues affecting all humanity. While we maintain distinct theological traditions, we share fundamental beliefs about human responsibility as stewards of creation. Perhaps our different perspectives can even strengthen our collective witness. Francis smiled broadly. Exactly. When I chose my papal name, I thought often about St. Francis's revolutionary understanding that all creation is our family. He called the sun his brother and the moon his sister. This was not merely poetic language. It was a radical reimagining of humanity's relationship with the natural world. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, ranging across topics from climate change to urban planning, from interfaith dialogue to the role of traditional institutions in modern society. Both men discovered unexpected common ground and mutual respect for each other's thoughtful approaches to complex challenges. Cardinal Toretti, monitoring the conversation's flow, began to prepare for the gift exchange that would conclude the formal audience. Vatican protocol dictated specific procedures for such exchanges, but Francis had already indicated his preference for allowing the moment to develop naturally rather than rushing through ceremonial requirements. Your Holiness, Charles said as he noticed subtle movements among the Vatican staff, I have brought some small tokens of respect and friendship if you would honor me by accepting them. Francis's eyes lit up with childlike curiosity. Despite receiving thousands of gifts during his papacy, he maintained genuine appreciation for the thought and symbolism behind each offering. I will be delighted, Your Majesty, and I hope you will accept some modest gifts from the Vatican as well. Sir Clive Alderton stepped forward carrying an ornately carved wooden box. Inside, wrapped in silk, lay the first edition copy of Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua. Charles lifted the book carefully, its leather binding still supple despite its age. Your Holiness, this is a first edition of Blessed John Henry Newman's spiritual autobiography. Cardinal Newman's journey from Anglican to Catholic and his subsequent canonization under your papacy represents the possibility of unity amid diversity. His witness suggests that theological dialogue can deepen rather than diminish faith. Francis received the book with obvious emotion, running his fingers over the embossed cover. Newman's intellectual honesty and spiritual courage had long impressed him, and the saint's example of finding truth through careful study and prayer resonated with his own approach to theological questions. Your Majesty, this is extraordinarily meaningful. Newman's example reminds us that seeking truth requires both intellectual rigor and spiritual humility. His journey from Canterbury to Rome need not be seen as rejection of his Anglican heritage, but as fulfillment of his deepest spiritual longings. Sir Clive, then, presented the silver chalice, its surface gleaming with intricate engravings depicting biblical scenes. British craftsmen had worked for months to create this piece, using traditional techniques while incorporating modern artistic elements. The chalice's design honored Catholic liturgical traditions while showcasing the finest British ecclesiastical metalwork. This chalice, Charles explained, was created by artisans who traced their skills back to medieval English monasteries. Before the Reformation, English craftsmen created some of Europe's finest liturgical vessels. This piece represents continuity with that tradition and hopes for future cooperation. Francis accepted the chalice with reverence, understanding its symbolic significance. The gift acknowledged historical wounds while expressing hope for healing. English monasteries had indeed produced magnificent liturgical art before Henry VIII's dissolution, and this modern chalice suggested that artistic and spiritual traditions could be renewed rather than lost forever. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, Francis said, examining the detailed engravings. And the symbolism touches my heart. I often think about the English martyrs, both Catholic and Protestant, who died for their convictions during the Reformation. Perhaps now we can honor their memory by choosing dialogue over division. The Pope then signaled for his own gifts to be presented. Monsignor Siccorsi approached carrying a velvet-covered tray containing the specially commissioned mosaic. Vatican artisans had worked in the ancient tradition of Roman mosaicists, using tiny tesserae of colored stone and gold leaf to create a luminous image. "Your Majesty," Francis said as he presented the mosaic, "this depicts my patron saint, Francis of Assisi, surrounded by the birds he loved so dearly. But I hope you will see in it a reflection of your own commitment to protecting God's creatures and caring for our common home." Charles studied the mosaic carefully, appreciating both its artistic beauty and symbolic meaning. The figure of Saint Francis radiated joy and peace, surrounded by birds rendered in exquisite detail. Gold leaf caught the light, making the entire piece seem to glow with inner illumination. "Your Holiness, this is magnificent." Saint Francis's example of joyful simplicity and love for all creation speaks across centuries and denominational boundaries. "I will treasure this always, and it will remind me daily of our conversation and our shared commitment." Francis then presented the calligraphed text from Laudato Si, bound in leather worked by Vatican bookbinders. The selected passages focused on themes of unity, stewardship, and hope, messages that transcended theological differences to address humanity's common challenges. "These reflections on environmental care," Francis explained, "represent my attempt to translate ancient wisdom into contemporary language. I hope they might serve your own ministry of environmental stewardship." The gift exchange concluded. Both leaders sat quietly for a moment, recognizing the significance of what had transpired. They had moved beyond diplomatic courtesy to establish genuine personal connection and shared purpose. The gifts would serve as lasting reminders of this encounter, but, more importantly, they had laid groundwork for continued cooperation on issues affecting all humanity. Cardinal Toretti approached discreetly, indicating that the formal audience had reached its scheduled conclusion. However, neither the Pope nor the King seemed eager to end their conversation. Francis looked at Charles with the warmth of a pastor who had found an unexpected kindred spirit. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "I hope this is the beginning of many conversations, not the end of one. The challenges facing our world require all people of good will to work together, regardless of the particular traditions that shaped our faith." Charles nodded, deeply moved by the entire experience. "Your Holiness, I leave here inspired and grateful. This meeting has exceeded my highest hopes for what might be accomplished when we approach each other with open hearts and minds." As they prepared to part, both men understood that they had participated in something historically significant that would resonate far beyond the Vatican's ancient walls. The formal audience concluded, but Pope Francis surprised the Vatican staff by inviting King Charles for an informal walk through the papal gardens. This spontaneous gesture, typical of Francis's pastoral approach, extended their time together beyond protocol requirements and allowed for more personal conversation away from ceremonial constraints. "Your Majesty, if you have a few additional minutes, perhaps you would enjoy seeing our gardens. They provide a peaceful space for reflection, and I find that walking often helps important conversations develop more naturally." Charles accepted eagerly, genuinely interested in both the botanical treasures and the continued dialogue. The Vatican gardens represented 8 centuries of papal cultivation, containing rare plants from across the Catholic world, and providing successive popes with space for contemplation and prayer. Cardinal Toretti quickly coordinated with security personnel to accommodate this unscheduled addition to the visit. Swiss guards took discreet positions along garden pathways while Vatican gardeners paused their work to allow the distinguished visitors privacy for their conversation. As they walked along ancient stone paths lined with Mediterranean cypresses and carefully maintained flower beds, Francis pointed out various plantings that held special significance. This section contains plants from every continent where Catholic missions have established roots. Each garden bed tells a story of faith crossing cultural and geographical boundaries. Charles examined the diverse plantings with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades creating and maintaining his own organic gardens. Your Holiness, the integration of species from different climates is remarkable. This seems to reflect your vision of the Church itself. Unity amid diversity, different traditions contributing to a greater whole. Exactly, Francis exclaimed, delighted by Charles's perception. You understand. These plants teach us that diversity strengthens rather than weakens the garden. Each species contributes something unique, and together they create beauty that no single plant could achieve alone. They paused beside a fountain dating to the Renaissance, its gentle water music providing a peaceful backdrop for their conversation. Francis sat on a marble bench, gesturing for Charles to join him. The informal setting encouraged a level of openness that formal throne rooms could not accommodate. Tell me, Francis said, his tone becoming more personal, how do you maintain hope when facing the enormous challenges of our time? As leaders, we see humanity's capacity for both great good and terrible destruction. Some days, the darkness seems overwhelming. Charles considered this profound question carefully. Your Holiness, I find hope in unexpected places. A young entrepreneur creating sustainable technology. A farmer adopting regenerative practices. Communities coming together to solve local problems. These small actions, multiplied across millions of people, can transform the world. Francis nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I see this too. During my papacy, I have met countless ordinary people doing extraordinary things, often without recognition or reward. They remind me that God's grace works through human hands, even when those hands seem small and powerless. The conversation turned to their personal journeys toward leadership. Both men had taken unconventional paths to their current roles. Francis as the first Jesuit pope, and the first from the Americas, Charles as a king who had waited decades to assume the throne while developing his own unique approach to royal service. I must confess, Charles said with characteristic honesty, that becoming king later in life brought unexpected advantages. The years of preparation allowed me to understand my role differently than might have been possible as a young monarch. Perhaps wisdom sometimes requires patience. Francis laughed warmly. I became pope at 76, so I understand completely. Age brings perspective that youth often lacks. We have both learned that leadership is about service, not privilege. Our positions give us platforms to advocate for the voiceless and care for the vulnerable. As they walked deeper into the gardens, passing ancient olive trees that had witnessed centuries of papal history, their conversation became increasingly philosophical. Both men grappled with questions about the role of traditional institutions in rapidly changing societies. Sometimes I wonder, Francis mused, whether ancient institutions like the papacy and monarchy can truly serve modern humanity. We carry so much historical baggage, some beautiful, some painful. How do we honor the past while embracing necessary change? Charles had wrestled with similar questions throughout his long preparation for kingship. I believe our institutions survive because they embody something beyond their historical accidents, ideals of service, continuity, and hope that transcend any individual leader's limitations. But we must constantly reform ourselves to serve those ideals better. They paused beside a grove of trees planted by previous popes, each plaque marking a different era in Vatican history. Francis touched the bark of an oak planted by Pope John XIV, the pontiff who had convened the Second Vatican Council that transformed modern Catholicism. Good Pope John planted this after announcing the council, Francis explained. He said he wanted to plant seeds of hope that future generations would harvest. I think about that often. What seeds are we planting today? Charles studied the mature tree, imagining the young sapling it had once been. Perhaps our meeting today plants its own seeds, Your Holiness. We cannot know what fruit our dialogue might bear, but we can trust that authentic conversation between people of good will serve God's purposes. The papal gardens held thousands of such trees and plants, each with its own story of papal attention and care. Francis led Charles to a newer section where he had personally established a vegetable garden, growing herbs and vegetables that supplied the Vatican kitchens while demonstrating sustainable agricultural practices. This project brings me particular joy, Francis said, kneeling to examine tomato plants heavy with fruit. Working with soil and seeds connect me to my childhood in Argentina and reminds me that all life depends on our care for the earth. Even popes must remember that we are gardeners first, administrators second. Charles knelt beside him, appreciating both the practical wisdom and spiritual symbolism of the Pope's garden project. Your example here echoes St. Benedict's insight that manual labor enriches spiritual life. Your Holiness demonstrates that caring for creation is not abstract theology, but concrete daily practice. They spent nearly an hour in the gardens, their conversation ranging across personal experiences, theological insights, and shared concerns about global challenges. As they prepared to return to the Apostolic Palace, Francis showed Charles one final garden feature, a meditation area he had created shortly after becoming pope. Simple wooden benches surrounded a small fountain, with aromatic plants providing a peaceful environment for prayer and reflection. I often come here when facing difficult decisions, Francis explained. The combination of flowing water, growing plants, and open sky helps me remember that God's creation offers wisdom beyond human understanding. Perhaps you have similar places that provide spiritual renewal. Charles smiled, thinking of his own gardens at Highgrove and other royal residences. Indeed, Your Holiness, their different religious traditions had not created barriers, but had actually enriched their dialogue. Vatican staff noticed the change in both leaders as they returned from the gardens. The formal courtesy of their initial meeting had given way to the warmth of two men who had discovered unexpected kinship. Their animated conversation and relaxed body language suggested that something significant had occurred during their time together. Cardinal Toretti approached as they reached the palace entrance, his expression curious about the extended garden visit. Francis anticipated his question with a grin that suggested mischief. Cardinal, His Majesty has taught me several things about organic gardening that I want to implement immediately. We must schedule follow-up conversations about sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship. This cannot be a single meeting, but the beginning of ongoing dialogue. Charles nodded enthusiastically. Your Holiness, I would welcome any opportunity for continued conversation. Perhaps we might explore possibilities for practical cooperation between Anglican and Catholic environmental initiatives. The spontaneous extension of their meeting had created momentum for future collaboration. Both leaders recognized that their personal connection could facilitate broader cooperation between their institutions on issues of mutual concern. As they prepared to part, Francis made one final gesture that surprised even experienced Vatican observers. He removed his own pectoral cross, a simple wooden cross he had worn throughout his papacy, and pressed it briefly to his lips before offering it to Charles. Your Majesty, please accept this as a personal token of our friendship and shared commitment to serving God's people. It is not ornate gold or precious stones, but simple wood from Argentina. I hope it will remind you that despite our institutional differences, we serve the same Lord and the same creation. Charles received the cross with obvious emotion, understanding the profound personal significance of the Pope's gesture. Pectoral crosses were deeply meaningful to Catholic bishops and popes, worn close to the heart as symbols of their pastoral office and personal devotion. Your Holiness, I am deeply honored and will treasure this always. Your generosity overwhelms me, and this cross will remind me daily of our conversation and our shared hopes for the future. The unexpected gift created a moment of profound silence in the courtyard, witnessed by Vatican staff who understood they had observed something extraordinary. Papal pectoral crosses were rarely given as personal gifts, making Francis's gesture particularly significant. As Charles prepared to depart, both men knew their relationship had transcended diplomatic formality to become genuine friendship rooted in shared values and mutual respect. The gifts they had exchanged, both formal and spontaneous, would serve as lasting reminders of this historic encounter. But more importantly, they had established foundations for continued cooperation on issues affecting all humanity. The King's motorcade prepared for departure as Vatican bells chimed the afternoon hour, their ancient bronze voices carrying news of this historic meeting across Rome and beyond. Monsignor Soccorsi entered the papal study carrying afternoon tea, noting his superior's contemplative mood. "Holy Father, how would you characterize today's meeting?" The staff noticed that it extended well beyond the scheduled time. The meeting had exceeded every expectation, transforming what could have been mere protocol into profound personal and spiritual encounter. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, met with Pope Francis that evening to discuss the day's events and their implications for Catholic-Anglican relations. Parolin had served as the Holy See's chief diplomat for over a decade, orchestrating papal meetings with world leaders, but today's encounter struck him as particularly significant. "Holy Father," Parolin said as they reviewed preliminary media coverage, "this meeting appears to have created genuine momentum for practical cooperation. King Charles's environmental advocacy aligns remarkably with your own priorities, and his obvious sincerity impressed everyone who observed the audience." Francis nodded, still energized by the day's conversations despite his advanced age. "Cardinal, I believe we witnessed the Holy Spirit at work today. When two people approach each other with open hearts and genuine desire to serve God's creation, remarkable things become possible. We must explore concrete ways to build on this foundation." The Pope's enthusiasm reflected his deep conviction that institutional cooperation could amplify individual efforts to address global challenges. Climate change, poverty, and social injustice required responses that transcended denominational boundaries, and today's meeting had demonstrated that such cooperation was both possible and necessary. In London, Archbishop Justin Welby, the titular head of the Anglican Communion, received detailed briefings about the papal audience. As Archbishop of Canterbury, Welby maintained complex relationships with both the British monarchy and the Vatican, making today's meeting particularly significant for Anglican Catholic dialogue. Welby's staff had monitored Vatican communications throughout the day, recognizing that King Charles's visit represented potential breakthrough in centuries of occasionally strained Anglican Catholic relations. The Archbishop prepared a statement welcoming the meeting's success while emphasizing shared Christian commitment to environmental stewardship and social justice. Today's historic meeting between His Majesty and His Holiness demonstrates that our common baptism creates bonds stronger than our theological differences, Welby's statement read. Both leaders exemplify servant leadership focused on caring for God's creation and God's people. Their dialogue opens new possibilities for practical cooperation on issues affecting all humanity. Vatican Communications Director Matteo Bruni worked through the evening preparing comprehensive media materials about the audience. The Holy See recognized that today's meeting had created significant international interest, and careful communication would be essential to maximize its positive impact on interfaith relations. Bruni's team prepared photograph releases, interview excerpts, and background materials emphasizing themes of environmental cooperation, interfaith dialogue, and shared commitment to human dignity. The Vatican's sophisticated media apparatus ensured that news of the historic encounter would reach global audiences through multiple channels. Within 24 hours, major international newspapers featured front-page stories about the papal audience. The Times of London emphasized the gift exchange and its symbolic significance for British Vatican relations. L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's official newspaper, focused on environmental themes and the potential for practical cooperation between Anglican and Catholic institutions. The Associated Press reported that Vatican sources described the meeting as extraordinarily successful and beyond expectations, while Reuters emphasized the spontaneous garden walk that extended the formal audience. CNN interviewed Catholic and Anglican theologians who emphasized the meeting's significance for broader Christian unity efforts. Social media amplified coverage of the historic encounter, with images of the gift exchange and garden walk generating millions of views across platforms. Young people particularly responded to the environmental themes that had dominated the conversation, seeing in both leaders examples of how traditional institutions could address contemporary challenges. Dr. Sarah Williams, a specialist in Anglican-Catholic relations at Oxford University, provided commentary that captured scholarly assessment of the meeting's significance. Today's encounter represents the culmination of decades of gradually improving relations between these ancient institutions. More importantly, it demonstrates how a shared commitment to environmental stewardship can create new foundations for Christian cooperation. The academic community recognized that today's meeting would likely be studied for years as an example of successful religious diplomacy. The combination of formal protocol and spontaneous personal connection had created a template for how traditional institutions could engage authentically across denominational boundaries. Pope Francis spent that evening in his private chapel, praying for continued wisdom in building on the day's breakthrough. The Argentine Pope understood that single meetings, however successful, required follow-up action to achieve lasting impact. He instructed his staff to begin planning concrete initiatives that could demonstrate the practical cooperation he and Charles had discussed. King Charles returned to his private prayers in his hotel suite, holding the Pope's wooden cross as he reflected on the day's spiritual significance. The simple Argentine would connected him to Francis's humble background while symbolizing their shared commitment to servant leadership and environmental stewardship. Both leaders understood that they had participated in something historically significant that would resonate far beyond their individual institutions. The gifts they had exchanged would serve as permanent reminders of this encounter, but, more importantly, they had established foundations for ongoing collaboration on issues affecting all humanity. Vatican archivists that night began preparing materials documenting the historic audience for permanent preservation in the secret archives. Future historians would study today's meeting as a pivotal moment in Anglican-Catholic relations and as an example of how religious leaders could transcend institutional differences to address global challenges. The King's private secretary received multiple requests for follow-up meetings and joint initiatives from both Anglican and Catholic organizations inspired by news of the successful papal audience. Environmental groups particularly seized on the shared commitment both leaders had demonstrated to creation care and sustainable development. Within a week, joint Anglican-Catholic working groups were being established to explore practical cooperation on environmental initiatives, interfaith dialogue programs, and social justice advocacy. The personal connection between Francis and Charles had catalyzed broader institutional engagement at multiple levels. A month later, Vatican and Buckingham Palace simultaneously announced plans for ongoing collaboration on environmental education, sustainable development projects, and interfaith dialogue initiatives. The joint statement emphasized that both leaders viewed their historic meeting as beginning rather than conclusion of deeper cooperation. The wooden cross and silver chalice, Newman's autobiography, and Francis's mosaic, the calligraphed texts, and garden memories, all became symbols of what remained possible when people of good will approach each other with open hearts and genuine desire to serve humanity's common good. History would remember this day as the moment when two ancient institutions chose cooperation over competition, when shared values transcended theological differences, and when authentic friendship between leaders created foundations for broader healing in a wounded world. The Vatican bells that had welcomed King Charles that morning continued their ancient rhythm, marking time's passage while proclaiming that some moments transcend temporal limitations to become eternal reminders of humanity's highest possibilities. In the heart of Christianity's most ancient center of power, hope had taken root and begun to flower in ways that would bear fruit for generations yet to come.